We called him a fool. Every last one of us, we called him a fool. We were so certain he would be the first to die when winter came that some of us had already discussed who would claim his tools after they found his frozen body inside that ridiculous eight-sided structure he insisted on building, while the rest of us did things the way they were meant to be done. But when the worst winter any of us had ever seen finally arrived, with a fury that made grown men weep and pray, in the same breath it was Linus Newberry's Octagon that kept us alive. And it was our own proven, sensible, time-tested rectangular cabins that nearly killed every one of us. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, to the spring of 1857, when none of us knew what was coming, and all of us were absolutely sure we knew everything worth knowing about how to survive on the frontier. 8 months before that winter, before the cold came, Linus Newberry stepped down from a supply wagon at the edge of what would become Clearwater County, Minnesota, on the last Friday of March in 1857. He carried a leather valise so worn the stitching had turned white, a canvas roll of carpenter's tools that clinked faintly with each step, and a book. The book was the thing people noticed first because he held it the way other men held rifles, close to his chest with both hands, as though someone might try to take it from him. It was called A Home for All, written by a man named Orson Fowler, and Linus had read it so many times during the Atlantic crossing that the binding had split twice and been repaired with sailcloth thread. The margins were filled with notes in a cramped hand, calculations and sketches and measurements that spilled across every blank space the printer had left. On one particular page, the page that described the thermal efficiency of octagonal structures compared to rectangular ones, Linus had written 2 words in pencil that had nothing to do with architecture. For Ansel. Ansel was his older brother, had been his older brother. 3 winters ago in the coastal valleys west of Bergen, where their family had built homes for 4 generations, Ansel had rushed to complete a house before the first November storms. He cut corners, measured loosely, sealed joints with whatever was available rather than what was right. He told Linus that perfection was the enemy of survival, that a finished house with flaws would always beat an unfinished house with perfect angles. And Linus had not argued because Ansel was older and had always known more about everything. The storm hit on a Tuesday night, wind speeds that the old fishermen later said they had never witnessed in 60 years of watching the Norwegian coast try to murder everything that lived on it. At 3 in the morning, the north wall of Ansel's house separated from the east wall at the corner joint. Not completely, just enough. A gap of perhaps 6 centimeters where the logs had been cut too quickly and fitted without the care their grandfather would have demanded. The wind found that gap the way water finds a crack in a dam, and within an hour the temperature inside dropped below what a human body can sustain. Linus found his brother at dawn. Ansel was sitting upright in his chair facing the failed corner, as though he had spent his final hours staring at the mistake that was killing him, understanding it completely, but unable to fix it because his hands had already stopped working. His wife and children had survived only because they had been sleeping in the back room closer to the hearth with the door closed. But Ansel, who had stayed up to feed the fire, who had positioned himself between his family and the cold Ansel, had frozen in his chair while trying to stuff rags into a gap that should never have existed. Linus dug the grave himself. The ground was frozen so hard that each swing of the pickaxe sent shockwaves up his arms until he could no longer feel his fingers. It took 2 days. During those 2 days, standing in a hole in the frozen earth with his dead brother wrapped in blankets above him, Linus made a decision that would follow him across an ocean and into a new country. He would never build a house without measuring every angle, testing every joint, calculating every stress point. He would never again trust speed over precision. and he would never for the rest of his life allow anyone he could reach to die because a wall was built wrong. That was the man who stepped off the wagon in Minnesota. The other settlers did not know any of this. They saw a tall, quiet Norwegian with a strange book and a way of walking that seemed deliberately slow, as though he had all the time in the world. And in a territory where winter could arrive as early as October and kill you by November if you weren't ready, deliberateness looked like stupidity. The settlement that was forming around the wagon road already had a rhythm by the time Linus arrived. Families had claimed their parcels' broken ground and begun the race against the calendar that defined frontier life. Clement Ogden was the loudest voice in that rhythm. 40 years old, barrel-chested with a Pennsylvania German accent that flattened every vowel into something that sounded like an order. Ogden had built 2 log cabins in his life and considered himself the foremost authority on frontier construction within any reasonable distance. He did not ask for opinions. He gave instructions. His sons, 2 teenage boys with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's silence, were already notching logs under his direction when Linus began walking the available parcels. Ogden was not a cruel man. That was the thing people would later struggle to reconcile. He genuinely believed he was helping men. He told people what to do, genuinely believed that 30 years of practical experience outweighed any amount of book learning, and genuinely believed that immigrants who brought foreign ideas to American soil were not just wrong, but dangerous. He had a secret that explained some of his certainty, though he never spoke of it. The first cabin he ever built back in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, had cracked along all 4 corners during its first winter. The family survived, but barely. Ogden blamed bad timber. He told the story that way for decades: bad timber and an unusually harsh season, and eventually he believed it himself. To admit otherwise would mean admitting that his method, the method he had taught others and built his reputation on, was fundamentally flawed. Sterling Darvish was 30 years old, Irish, quick to laugh and quicker to agree with whoever seemed to be winning any given argument. He had arrived in Minnesota 6 weeks before Linus with his wife Charity and 2 small children, carrying almost nothing and desperate to belong somewhere after 3 years of moving from job to job across the eastern states. Darvish built fast. His philosophy was simple and widely shared: get the walls up, get the roof on, worry about the details when there is time. His logs were 15 centimeters thick, adequate for keeping out rain and providing basic wind resistance. But he had made no special provisions for the kind of cold that could freeze saliva before it hit the ground. He did not hate Linus. But when Ogden laughed at the Norwegian, Darvish laughed too, because laughter was the currency of belonging, and Darvish could not afford to be an outsider again. Mercy Halstead had arrived 3 weeks before Linus and had spoken to almost no one since. She was 28 years old with 2 children, Cora, who was 7, and Rufus, who was 4. Her husband Ira had died on the trail from Iowa when their wagon overturned crossing a swollen creek. He hit his head on a rock beneath the water and never surfaced alive. Mercy pulled his body out herself, buried him on the creek bank with a wooden cross she carved with his own knife, and then drove the wagon the remaining 200 miles to Minnesota alone with 2 children who kept asking when Papa would come back from heaven. She had claimed the smallest available parcel and was building the smallest cabin in the settlement, 3 meters by 4, working alone because no one had offered to help and she had not asked. It was the only structure being raised by a single woman, and it showed in the careful, slow, exhausting progress she made each day. She was strong, but she was also running out of time, and she knew it. Mercy did not laugh at Linus when the others did, but she did not defend him either. She watched from her own building site with the expression of a woman who had learned that hoping for anything unconventional usually ended in disappointment. Life had taught her that lesson repeatedly and at great cost, and she was not interested in relearning it. Reverend Hiram Bramwell, had arrived with the first wave of settlers, but owned no land and was building no structure. He was 55 years old, white-haired with a deep voice that made everything he said sound like it came from a source higher than himself. He lived with the Ogden family, sleeping in their loft, eating at their table, and this arrangement created an obligation he would never openly acknowledge but could never quite escape. When Ogden had an opinion, Bramwell tended to agree with it, and when Bramwell agreed with something, the rest of the settlement treated it as moral fact. Ephraim Quarles was 33, a German-trained carpenter who had spent 5 years building houses in St. Louis before deciding that city life was slowly killing his soul. He was quiet in the way that people who are always thinking tend to be quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are still deciding whether what they have to say is worth the trouble it might cause. He recognized something in Linus's approach that the others missed, a precision and intentionality that spoke of real knowledge, but he kept this recognition to himself. Quarles had learned in St. Louis that being right loudly was less useful than being right quietly, and he was waiting. Charity Darvish was 27 and more practical than her husband, which was not difficult since Sterling's primary skill was enthusiasm, and his primary weakness was following it wherever it led. She watched Linus work from her kitchen window each day and saw something the others refused to see. Not madness, dedication. The kind of focus that came from a person who knew exactly why every detail mattered and was unwilling to explain it to people who had already decided not to listen. Micah Pemberton sold everything: lumber, nails, tools, salt pork flour, and advice, though the advice was free only because no one would have paid for it. He was 45 and had the instincts of a man who understood that in a small community, profit and social dynamics were the same thing. He did not care who was right about construction methods. He cared who had influence and who had money, and right now, Clement Ogden had both. This was the world Linus Newberry walked into when he began marking an octagon on the ground. The ridicule started immediately. Ogden was the first to notice and the first to speak, which was always the case with Ogden. He walked over to Linus's plot with 3 other men trailing behind him, the way smaller fish trail behind a shark, not because they were invited, but because proximity to Ogden felt like safety. "That Norwegian is building a church instead of a house," Ogden announced to anyone within earshot, gesturing at the 8-sided outline Linus had staked into the dirt. 8 sides and angles everywhere, like he is some kind of architect instead of a settler. He will spend all summer just figuring out how to cut the logs to fit, while the rest of us are already sitting by our fires. Linus looked up from his measurements. He could have stayed silent, and part of him wanted to. The part that understood silence was safer than confrontation in a place where he was already an outsider. But another part of him, the part that had dug a grave in frozen ground for a brother who should not have died, would not allow the moment to pass. An octagon with the same perimeter of wall encloses 20% more floor area than a rectangle. He said his accent thick, but his English precise. And fewer sharp corners means fewer points where heat escapes. In a place where winter can kill, that is not architecture. It is survival. Ogden laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the laugh of a man who had heard something so absurd that mockery was the only reasonable response. "Books do not keep you warm, friend. Experience keeps you warm. And I have got 30 years of experience that says 4 walls and 4 corners have worked perfectly fine since before either of us was born." The men behind Ogden nodded. Of course they nodded. Linus looked down at the book in his hand, then back up at the faces arrayed before him. He saw no malice in most of them, just the comfortable certainty of people who had never been forced to question what they knew. He held their gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to his measurements. From 50 meters away, Mercy Halstead watched the entire exchange while hammering a peg into her own foundation. Cora tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, why is his house round?" "Because he thinks he knows better than everyone," Mercy said. But her voice was not certain, and she noticed, even if she did not want to, that the lines Linus had marked on the ground were perfectly straight and evenly spaced, and that the angles between them looked like they had been calculated rather than guessed. She pushed the thought away and returned to her own small rectangle. The following Sunday, Reverend Bramwell delivered his weekly sermon to the assembled settlement. He stood on a stump outside the Ogden cabin, Bible in one hand, the other hand punctuating his words with gestures that looked almost like accusations. He spoke about the sin of pride, about men who place their own cleverness above the collective wisdom of their community, about the danger of believing yourself smarter than everyone around you and the ruin that such arrogance inevitably brought. He did not mention Linus by name. He did not need to. Linus sat in the back row of the makeshift congregation on a log he had carried over himself and listened to every word. His face showed nothing. When the sermon ended, he stood and began walking back to his building site. Mercy caught up with him at the edge of the clearing. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she had seen his face during the sermon, the way he absorbed each word without flinching, and recognized something she felt in herself every day. "You should build like everyone else," she said. "Being different here means being alone, and being alone in winter can kill you." Linus stopped walking. He looked at her, and for a moment Mercy saw something in his eyes that she had not expected. Not anger, not defiance. Grief. "Building wrong also kills," he said quietly. "Ma'am." He walked away. Mercy stood in the clearing for a long time after he left, disturbed in a way she could not quite name. It was only later, lying awake in her half-finished cabin, listening to the wind test the gaps in her walls, that she realized he had not been talking about buildings in the abstract. He had been talking about someone specific, someone he had lost. The weeks that followed the sermon marked the deepest period of Linus's isolation. Men who had previously ignored him now actively avoided his building site, crossing to the far side of the wagon road when they passed, as though whatever foreign madness had infected the Norwegian might be contagious. Women who had nodded politely in the first weeks stopped making eye contact entirely. Only the children, who had not yet learned the social rules that govern their parents, continued to wander close to the octagonal foundation and stare with undisguised curiosity at the strange shape taking form on the ground. One afternoon in late July, Linus was squaring a log with his broadaxe when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Cora Halstead standing at the edge of his building site, holding a fistful of wildflowers she had picked from the prairie. She was alone. Her mother was nowhere in sight. "These are for your house," Cora said, holding out the flowers with the solemn formality of a child presenting a gift to a king. "Mama says flowers make any house prettier." Linus knelt down so he was at the girl's eye level. He took the flowers, carefully examined them as though they were architectural drawings requiring his full professional attention, and then placed them in a tin cup of water on his foundation stones. "Your mama is right," he said. "Thank you." Cora studied the octagonal outline on the ground. "My mama's house has 4 sides. Yours has 8. Is 8 better than 4? "Sometimes," Linus said. "It depends on what you are building for." "What are you building for?" Linus was quiet for a moment, then he said, "So nobody gets cold." Cora considered this with the gravity that only children can bring to simple statements. Then she turned and ran back toward her mother's cabin, her bare feet leaving small prints in the soft earth. Linus watched her go and felt something crack inside his chest, that he had been holding together with discipline and purpose for 3 years. It was the first real conversation he had with anyone in the settlement that did not involve mockery warnings or the careful diplomacy of people who thought he was making a terrible mistake. It was a 7-year-old girl with wildflowers, and it was enough to remind him why he was building this house. Not for himself, for the people who would need it when the cold came, even the ones who did not believe it yet. The following day, Ogden discovered the flowers on Linus's foundation and traced them back to the Halstead girl. He mentioned it to Mercy in passing, in the way men mention things when they want to deliver a warning without the responsibility of having warned. Your daughter has been visiting the Norwegian's building site. Might want to keep an eye on that. Mercy did not respond, but that evening she told Cora to stay closer to home, and the girl obeyed, and the tin cup of wildflowers sat on Linus's foundation stones until they wilted and dried and became small, brittle ghosts of color against the gray wood and gray stone and gray sky. While the other settlers finished their cabins and began splitting firewood for winter, Linus continued his methodical construction. He dug 45 centimeters deep and built stone foundations that raised his floor above the frost line. He mixed mortar from clay and sand, creating a moisture barrier that would prevent groundwater from wicking up into his log walls and rotting them from below. The process took 3 full weeks. By then, Ogden had finished his entire cabin and Darvish was installing his roof. But the foundation was just the beginning. The walls were where Linus's design diverged most dramatically from everything his neighbors understood about construction. He built 2 walls, an outer wall of 30-centimeter logs and an inner wall of 15-centimeter logs positioned 10 centimeters apart. The gap between them he filled with a mixture of sawdust, clay, and chopped prairie grass. It was an insulation system his grandfather had developed on the western Norwegian coast, where the sea wind could kill entire families if their houses were not prepared. The mixture trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets, creating a thermal barrier that a single thickness of logs, no matter how massive, could never match. This was the principle. It would prove itself in the months to come. Then came the confrontation Linus had not anticipated. He went to Micah Pemberton's supply yard to purchase white oak logs 30 centimeters in diameter, the only timber dense enough to provide both structural strength and meaningful thermal mass. Pemberton had the inventory. He quoted a fair price. Linus counted out his money. Then Pemberton hesitated, looked away, scratched his neck. "I have been thinking," Pemberton said, not meeting Linus's eyes. "Those heavy oaks, they are in high demand. The other families need them too. I can sell you the lighter pine, same length, half the price." It was Ogden. Linus understood immediately. Ogden had spoken to Pemberton privately, applied the kind of pressure that does not sound like threats but functions identically. Selling quality timber to a fool is a waste. If you prioritize the Norwegian over the families who actually know what they are doing, the families might start buying elsewhere. Pemberton is a businessman. He understood leverage, and Ogden had leverage. Linus left the supply yard without logs. He stood in the road for a long time, looking toward the tree line a mile to the north, where the white oaks grew thick along the river bottom. Then he picked up his broadaxe and walked into the forest alone. What happened next nearly killed him 3 times in 2 weeks. Felling a 30-centimeter oak is dangerous work for a crew of experienced loggers. For a single man working alone, it is an exercise in controlled catastrophe. Each tree required hours of careful cutting, strategic wedging, and constant awareness of which direction the crown would fall when the trunk finally gave way. Linus had to clear brush, calculate fall zones, cut limb section, and drag each log back to his building site by hand. A distance that grew longer with each trip as he exhausted the nearest suitable trees. On the 4th day, a white oak twisted as it fell, the trunk spinning in a direction Linus had not anticipated. He threw himself sideways and the base of the tree struck the ground where he had been standing 1 second earlier, with enough force to shake the earth beneath his boots. He lay on his back in the undergrowth, breathing hard, staring at the canopy overhead, and thought about the promise he had made in a frozen graveyard 3 years ago. He was not going to break it by dying under a falling tree in Minnesota. He got up, he kept cutting. Then something unexpected happened. On a Tuesday evening, as Linus dragged his sixth log toward his building site, arms shaking with exhaustion, face covered in scratches from branches and saw cuts from bark, he found a small wagon load of lumber sitting beside his foundation. Not the premium white oak he had wanted, standard pine medium grade, but sound timber properly dried and enough to supplement what he was harvesting from the forest. There was no note, no indication of who had sent it. It was Mercy. The evening before, she had walked to Pemberton's supply yard after the other settlers had gone home. She found him closing up for the night and said something she had been composing in her head all afternoon. "You refused to sell timber to the Norwegian because Ogden told you to. But have you considered what happens if that fool dies in the forest because he has to fell his own trees when they find his body and they talk about why he was out there alone? Your name will come up, Micah, and mine and everyone else's who stood by and watched." Pemberton said nothing. Mercy left. The next morning, a wagon of lumber appeared at Linus's site. Linus never knew who sent it. But that evening, for the first time since arriving in Minnesota, he allowed himself a small smile as he ran his hands along the grain of timber he had not cut himself. Someone somewhere in this settlement of strangers who had decided he was a fool had shown him a kindness he had not asked for and did not understand. Through August and September, the construction continued. Charity Darvish began leaving small packages on the fence post nearest Linus's building site. Bread, dried meat. Once a jar of preserved plums that she had brought all the way from Ohio. She never spoke to Linus when she left these things, and he never spoke to her about finding them. It was an understanding conducted entirely in objects and silence, and it sustained him through the long days of solitary work more than the food itself did. Charity hid this from Sterling. Her husband would not understand, and Ogden would consider it a betrayal of the community's unspoken consensus that the Norwegian deserved his isolation. Ephraim Quarles passed Linus's building site every evening on his way home. Each time his steps slowed a little more. He studied the emerging octagonal structure, the way a fellow craftsman studies work, that challenges his assumptions with resistance first, then reluctant interest, then genuine fascination. Quarles had his own reasons for caution. In St. Louis, he had once proposed a modification to a building design that his employer rejected without consideration. When the building developed the exact structural problem Quarles had predicted, the employer blamed the construction crew rather than admit he had ignored good advice. Quarles learned then that being right in public was a form of aggression that people punished, and he had carried that lesson into every professional relationship since. He would not make the Norwegian's mistake of announcing his knowledge to people who had already decided they knew better. But he would also not make the mistake of ignoring good work when he saw it. One night in late September, Linus looked up from his work and saw Quarles standing in the shadows beyond the lantern light, staring at the corner joint Linus had just completed. The angle was precisely 135 degrees. The logs met with a tolerance so tight that no daylight was visible between them. Their eyes met across the building site. Quarles inclined his head, a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for the wind moving his hat, then turned and walked away into the darkness. No words. But Linus understood. Somewhere in this settlement, there was at least one man who saw what he was building and recognized that it was not madness. October arrived and brought the first snow. Every cabin in the settlement was complete. Every cabin except one. Linus was still installing the roof beams of his Octagon. 8 roof surfaces had to be calculated and cut with precision, each beam meeting at the exact length and angle required to converge at a central peak. It was the most complex part of the entire structure, and it was taking longer than he had planned. That week, Ogden organized a community dinner at his cabin. He invited every family in the settlement, every family except Linus. They gathered around Ogden's table, crowded and warm with the heat of too many bodies in a small space, and Ogden stood at the head and made an announcement that several people later wished they had challenged. If the Norwegian freezes to death inside that octagon of his, that is the fault of his own pride, not ours. We warned him. Every one of us warned him. Whatever happens to him this winter, we carry no responsibility. Reverend Bramwell, sitting at Ogden's right hand, said nothing. His silence was agreement, and everyone in the room understood it. Mercy Halstead stared at her plate and felt something twist in her stomach. She thought about the lumber that had appeared at Linus's sight. She thought about the words she had said to Pemberton. She thought about what it meant that she had helped Linus in secret while letting him face his accusers alone in public, and the thought made her feel like a coward in a way that no amount of self-justification could relieve. Charity Darvish stood up, murmured something about needing to put the children to bed, and walked out. Sterling watched her go with a confused expression, but did not follow. That night, the storm came. It arrived without warning, a November gale that swept down from Canada with wind speeds that bent the pine trees nearly horizontal and drove snow sideways with the force of thrown gravel. Linus was on his roof, alone, in the dark, trying to secure the final ridge beams that would complete the most critical element of his entire structure. The wind hit him like a wall. One moment he was positioning a beam along the ridge line, fitting its end into the notch he had cut that afternoon. The next moment a gust tore the beam from his hands and sent it spinning into the darkness below. He grabbed for the nearest support and caught a rafter with his left hand, his body swinging outward over the edge of the roof as the wind tried to rip him free. He hung there, boots scraping against ice-covered logs, left hand cramping around a beam that was slick with freezing rain. Below him, the ground was invisible in the darkness, but he knew it was 5 meters down and frozen hard as concrete. A fall would break bones. Broken bones alone in a half-finished house in a Minnesota winter meant death. In the howling of the wind, in that moment of absolute physical extremity, when his fingers were failing and his grip was measured in seconds, Linus heard his brother's voice. Not really. He knew it was not real. It was memory or imagination or the kind of hallucination that extreme stress sometimes produces. But he heard it clearly as he had heard Ansel speak across the workshop in Bergen when they were boys learning their grandfather's trade. Do not rush, measure again. Linus closed his eyes, took one breath, then another. He pulled himself back onto the roof with strength he should not have had, retrieved the fallen beam from where it had lodged against the foundation, stones below, climbed back up, and measured again. The angle was off by 2 degrees. He corrected it, fitted the beam, secured it with wooden pegs. He drove home with a mallet, each blow ringing out across the settlement like a bell that nobody heard over the storm. He finished the last beam as the first gray light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. The roof was complete, 8 surfaces converging to a perfect peak. The octagon stood finished against the fading storm, its silhouette unlike anything else on the Minnesota prairie. That morning, Mercy Halstead was the first person in the settlement to see the completed structure. She had stepped outside to check on her woodpile and stopped. The octagon rose against the dawn sky with a geometry that was both foreign and somehow inevitable, as though the landscape had been waiting for exactly this shape to be placed upon it. 8 walls, 8 roof planes, a structure that looked less like a cabin and more like something that had been solved. Cora appeared beside her, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mama, it is beautiful. Mercy did not answer. But standing there in the thin morning light, looking at a roof that one man had completed alone in a storm that should have killed him, she felt the word fool begin to lose its meaning. Whatever Linus Newbury was, whatever his Octagon would prove to be, when the real cold came, it was not foolishness that had driven him to hang from a rafter in a November gale and refuse to fall. It was something else entirely. And Mercy Halstead, who had buried her husband alone and driven a wagon 200 miles with 2 small children and built a cabin with her own hands because no one offered to help, recognize that something, even if she could not yet bring herself to name it. The snow continued to fall. November deepened. And somewhere inside the Octagon, Linus Newbury sat beside his central hearth, opened his battered copy of Fowler, and turned to the page marked for Ansel. He had kept his promise. The house was built, every angle measured, every joint tested, every wall doubled and insulated against whatever the winter would bring. Now all that remained was to survive it. The cold came for Sterling, Darvish's daughter, first. It was the second week of November, and the temperature had been falling for 9 straight days, without pause or mercy. Nobody in the settlement owned a proper thermometer, but they did not need one. The signs were everywhere and impossible to ignore. Water left in a bucket froze solid before it could be carried 10 paces from the well. Breath crystallized into tiny shards of ice that caught the lantern in light like powdered glass. Bare skin that touched an iron door handle stuck instantly, and pulling free meant leaving a layer of flesh behind. Bethany Darvish was 3 years old. She stopped crying on the 4th night of the deep cold, and that was when Charity knew they were in real trouble. Children cry when they are cold. When they stop crying, when they go quiet and still, and their skin turns the color of old candle wax, it means the body is beginning to shut down functions it considers non-essential in order to keep the heart beating and the brain alive. Charity had seen this once before on the ship from Ireland, when a baby in steerage went silent for 6 hours and then never woke up. She wrapped Bethany in every blanket they owned and held her against her own body and stared at the wall of their cabin, the wall that Sterling had built in 2 weeks flat, following the method that Clement Ogden had assured everyone was perfectly adequate for a Minnesota winter. Frost covered the interior surface in a sheet so thick that Charity could have written her name in it with her fingernail. It never melted. The fire burned constantly, Sterling feeding it every hour through the night, and still the frost remained, as though the cold outside was so vast and so patient that their little fire was nothing more than an insult it chose to ignore. Sterling had realized the firewood problem 3 days earlier. Their cabin consumed fuel at nearly double the rate he had calculated when he stacked his winter supply in September. The logs burned hot, but the heat vanished through the walls almost as fast as it was produced, like pouring water into a basket and wondering why the basket never filled. He had gone to Micah Pemberton to buy more, but Pemberton had tripled his prices. Demand was desperate and supply was frozen into the ground, and Pemberton was a businessman before he was a neighbor. Sterling could not afford the new prices. He went to Ogden. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, and Sterling replayed it in his mind for the rest of the winter, each word etched into his memory with the permanence of a scar. Clement, I need to share firewood. I will pay you back in spring, double what I take, I swear it. Ogden had not even looked up from the log he was splitting. Every family has to take care of its own Sterling. I do not have enough for 2 households. Nobody does. But you told me this method would work. You said 4 walls and a good fire, that is all a man needs. Now Ogden looked up. His face was not angry, it was closed. The face of a man who had built a wall inside himself that was stronger than any wall he had ever built from timber. I said what has always worked. This winter is unusually harsh. That is not my fault, and it is not my problem. Sterling walked home through snow that reached his knees, and for the first time since arriving in Minnesota, he felt the specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. The cold of realizing that the person you trusted to guide you does not consider your survival his concern. That night, Charity said the thing Sterling had been dreading. "We need to go to the Norwegian." Sterling was sitting by the fire feeding it a log that would buy them perhaps 2 more hours of marginal warmth. He did not look at his wife. "No." "Sterling," I said, "no, I will figure something out. I will go further into the timber tomorrow, find deadfall, something." "Sterling, your daughter has not cried in 3 days. 3 days. Do you understand what that means?" He understood. He understood completely. But understanding and acting are separated by a canyon called pride. And Sterling Darvish was standing on the wrong side of it, looking across at his daughter's life on the other side and still unable to make his legs move. Charity did not wait for his legs to decide. On the 7th night of deep cold at somewhere around 11 at night, a sound split the darkness inside the Darvish cabin. It was not loud in the way that thunder is loud. It was loud in the way that a bone breaking is loud, a sharp, dense crack that communicated a structural failure at a frequency the human body understands before the mind can process it. A section of the east wall had buckled. Thermal stress had been working on the joints for days, expanding and contracting the wood in cycles that loosened every connection Sterling had made in his rush to finish before winter. Now a gap had opened, a long diagonal crack that ran from knee height to the ceiling, and through it the wind entered the cabin like an animal that had been waiting outside for exactly this opportunity. The temperature inside dropped so fast that Charity could feel it moving across the room toward her children. She did not discuss it with Sterling. She did not ask permission. She stood up, wrapped Bethany in the heaviest blanket, grabbed her son's hand, and walked to the door. Sterling stood in the middle of his broken cabin, staring at the crack in his wall, the way a captain stares at a hole in the hull of his ship, knowing exactly what it means and unable to accept it. Then he ran after his wife. The walk to the Octagon was 200 meters through snow and wind that turned the distance into something that felt like miles. Charity held Bethany against her chest and kept her son close behind her, leaning into the gale, counting steps because counting was the only thing keeping her from screaming. When they reached the Octagon, it was not Linus who opened the door. It was Mercy Halstead. Mercy had been living in the Octagon for 5 days. She opened the door with Rufus on her hip and Cora peering around her legs in the warm air that flowed outward, hit Charity's face like a hand placed gently on a wound. Mercy looked at Charity, looked at Bethany limp and pale in her blankets, looked at the boy clutching his mother's coat with fingers that had gone white. She stepped aside without a word. Charity walked in. The warmth surrounded her immediately, not the aggressive blast of standing too close to a fire, but something deeper and more even, a warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the walls themselves and the floor and the air, as though the entire structure was a living thing that radiated heat the way a body radiates heat when it holds a child. She looked down at Bethany. The girl's eyelids flickered. Color, faint but present, began to return to her cheeks. Charity sat down beside the central hearth and began to cry. Not from sadness, not from relief exactly, though relief was part of it. She cried because for the first time in 2 weeks she was not afraid that her daughter would die before morning. And the absence of that fear, the sudden lifting of a weight she had been carrying every minute of every hour without acknowledging it, because acknowledging it would have made it unbearable. The removal of that weight was so overwhelming that her body did the only thing it knew how to do. Sterling appeared in the doorway a minute later, snow in his hair, shame on his face. Linus was sitting in the far corner, mending a leather strap by firelight. He looked up at Sterling, acknowledged him with a brief lift of his chin, and returned to his work. Mercy did something then that none of the adults in the room would ever forget. She took Bethany from Charity's arms gently, the way you take a child from a mother who has been holding on so tight that her hands have forgotten how to open. She carried the girl to the warmest spot beside the hearth, wrapped her in a dry blanket from her own bedding, and tucked the edges around her small body with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had kept two children alive through circumstances that should have killed all three of them. Then she did the same for the Darvish boy. It was a small act, blankets and a warm spot on the floor, but it was also the moment when something began to form inside the Octagon that had nothing to do with architecture or thermal dynamics or the mathematical properties of eight-sided structures. It was community, not the kind of community that forms around shared opinions or geographic convenience, but the kind that forms when people who have been surviving alone discover that survival is easier and less terrifying when you stop pretending you do not need each other. Linus watched Mercy work. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. 5 days earlier, Mercy had arrived at the Octagon under very different circumstances. It was 2 in the morning. The wind was screaming across the prairie with a sound like tearing metal, and inside Mercy's tiny cabin, the temperature had dropped below anything she had experienced in her life, including the night she buried Ira in Iowa. Rufus had stopped shivering. Like Bethany Darvish after him, the boy had gone quiet, his small body curling inward, his skin cold to the touch, in a way that made Mercy's hands shake with something far worse than cold. She did not hesitate. She did not think about what people would say. She did not consider the social implications of a widow going to a single man's home in the middle of the night. She picked up Rufus, grabbed Cora's hand, and walked out into the storm. She did not knock on Linus's door. She pounded on it with a fist that was already losing feeling, hammering until the wood shook in its frame, and when Linus opened it, she pushed past him without waiting for an invitation. She set Rufus down beside the hearth and began rubbing his hands and feet with a desperate energy that was half medical knowledge and half pure animal refusal to let her child die. Linus did not ask questions. He knelt beside her and took Will's other hand and began working warmth back into the tiny fingers with the patient, steady pressure of a man who understood exactly what was at stake because he had once failed to do this for someone he loved. It took an hour. Rufus's color returned slowly, then all at once the way spring arrives in northern countries. He opened his eyes, looked at his mother, and said, "Mama, I am hungry." Mercy laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since Ira died, and the sound surprised her so much that she stopped and put her hand over her mouth as though laughter were something she was no longer permitted. Linus brought soup. He had been keeping a pot warm on the hearth, some kind of Norwegian recipe with root vegetables and dried fish that tasted like nothing Mercy had ever eaten, but also tasted like the most delicious thing in the world because her son was alive and eating it. When Rufus and Cora were asleep, wrapped in blankets beside the fire, Mercy sat across from Linus's and said what she had come to say. Her voice was hoarse and broken, and she did not care. "You were right. Building wrong kills people. I almost let it kill my son because I was too proud to come here sooner." Linus did not look at her. He was staring at the fire, and his face held an expression Mercy could not read, something between sadness and recognition, as though her words had awakened a memory he kept locked away. "The boy will be fine," he said. "You came in time." "I almost did not." "But you did." There was a silence that lasted long enough for a log to crumble in the hearth and send sparks spiraling upward into the chimney. Then Mercy asked the question she had been carrying since that day in the clearing when Linus had said building wrong also kills. Who did you lose? Linus was quiet for so long that Mercy thought he would not answer. Then, without looking away from the fire, he told her about Ansel. He told her about the corner joint that failed, about the gap that let the wind in, about finding his brother frozen in his chair at dawn facing the wall that had killed him, about digging a grave in frozen ground for 2 days while his brother's body lay wrapped in blankets above him waiting. He told her about the book, about the Octagon, about the 2 words written in the margin of a page about thermal efficiency for Ansel. Mercy repeated softly. For Ansel, and for anyone else I can keep alive. Mercy understood then. The Octagon was not a building experiment. It was not scientific curiosity or immigrant stubbornness or the arrogance that Reverend Bramwell had preached against. It was a memorial, a promise made to a dead man in a frozen hole in the ground, kept across an ocean, and half a continent, expressed not in words or prayers, but in angles measured to the degree, in walls built twice as thick as anyone thought necessary. Every corner of this octagon was a correction of the corner that had killed his brother. Every measurement was an act of grief refined into purpose. She did not say any of this. She simply nodded, and the silence that followed held more understanding than any words could have carried. The days that followed Mercy's arrival established a pattern. She organized the interior of the Octagon with the quiet authority of a woman who had managed a household alone for 8 months and had no patience for inefficiency. She arranged sleeping areas, established a rotation for fire tending, set up a space for the children to play that kept them away from the hearth, and created a system for rationing food that was fair and transparent and left no room for argument. Linus watched her work with a kind of bewildered gratitude. He had designed the Octagon as a shelter for one person, a machine for survival optimized for thermal efficiency and structural integrity. He had not designed it to be a home. Mercy made it one. She hung a piece of cloth across one corner to create a changing area for the children. She established a rule that every adult would tell a story to the children each evening before sleep, because children who are entertained are children who are not frightened, and children who are not frightened do not cry through the night, keeping everyone awake. She found Linus's only pot, declared it inadequate, and somehow produced a second one from the wreckage of her own cabin, having made a trip back through the snow that she mentioned to no one, and that Linus only discovered when he saw her boots melting by the hearth. The stories became the heartbeat of the Octagon. Mercy told tales of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of a father who had been a school teacher and who believed that every person, man or woman, deserved to know how the world worked. Linus, when his turn came, told Norwegian folk tales about trolls who lived under bridges and fishermen who outwitted the sea. His English was thickly accented, and sometimes the grammar bent in directions that made the children laugh, and he discovered that making children laugh was a skill he had never known he possessed, and that pleased him more than any joint he had ever cut. Cora Halstead became his most devoted audience. She sat in the front of the children's circle every evening, her face tilted upward, absorbing every word with the same intensity her mother brought to rationing food and organizing sleeping arrangements. When Linus stumbled over an English word, Cora supplied it. When he forgot where he was in a story, she reminded him. A bond formed between the Norwegian carpenter and the fatherless girl that neither of them named, but that everyone in the Octagon observed and understood. When the Darvishes arrived 5 days later, Mercy absorbed them into the system without disruption. Charity Darvish, who had been leaving secret packages of food on Linus's fence post for months, finally met the man she had been feeding, and the first thing she said to him was, "You are thinner than I expected. I should have left bigger portions." It was the first time anyone in the settlement had acknowledged helping Linus, And the honesty of it made Linus laugh a sound so unexpected that several people in the room turned to stare, because none of them had ever heard the Norwegian laugh before. When other families came, Mercy absorbed them the same way. Linus built the walls. Mercy built the order within them. Neither of them discussed this arrangement. It simply happened the way water finds its level. By mid-December, Reverend Bramwell called a community meeting at Ogden's cabin. The stated purpose was to discuss pooling firewood resources for collective distribution. It sounded reasonable. It sounded fair. It was neither. The proposal was simple. Every household would contribute equally to a common woodpile, and the wood would be distributed based on family size. Equal contribution, equal share. The mathematics sounded elegant until you consider that Linus's Octagon consumed roughly half the fuel of any other structure for superior results. Asking him to contribute the same amount as households whose wasteful designs devoured twice the wood was not equality. It was punishment for being right. Linus attended the meeting. He sat in the back as he always did and listened while Bramwell outlined the plan with the measured, reasonable tone of a man who has already decided what the outcome will be. Ogden sat at the front, arms crossed, nodding at every point Bramwell made. When Bramwell finished, Linus stood. The room went quiet. "I am willing to share," he said, "not because it is fair. It is not fair, but because there are children who are cold, and fairness matters less than children." Ogden erupted. "Children who are cold. You sit in your warm octagon burning half the wood while the rest of us freeze, and you want to lecture us about children?" Mercy Halstead stood up. The room went quieter than quiet. Mercy was not a loud woman. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She simply stood, in the act of standing, of placing herself upright in a room full of seated men, carried a weight that no amount of shouting could have matched. "Clement," she said, and her voice was calm and precise and carried the kind of authority that comes not from position but from having earned the right to speak through suffering that everyone in the room knew about. "Your cabin is also cracking. I know because your daughter told my daughter. Before you judge the Norwegian for building a house that works, perhaps you should ask yourself why you are sitting in one that does not and still calling him wrong." Nobody spoke. Ogden's face went red, then white, then settled into an expression that looked like a man who has just been struck and is trying to decide whether to fight or retreat. Bramwell examined his hands. Sterling Darvish stared at the floor. Charity, sitting beside Sterling, placed her hand on Mercy's arm, a small gesture of solidarity that Mercy felt all the way to her bones. Mercy walked out. Linus followed her a moment later. They stood outside in the cold breath clouding between them. "You did not have to do that," Linus said. "Yes, I did. You never say anything for yourself. Someone has to." The redistribution plan went forward with Linus contributing an equal share as he had offered. It was unfair, and everyone knew it, and nobody changed it because changing it would have required admitting things that most people in the settlement were not yet ready to admit. Christmas came. The temperature dropped further into territory that even the oldest settlers said they had never seen. And on the night of December 27th, the thing that everyone had been expecting and nobody had been willing to predict finally happened. Clement Ogden appeared outside the Octagon. He did not come alone. His wife stood behind him with the two teenage sons, all four of them, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, their faces raw and chapped, their bodies rigid with a cold that had penetrated past clothing and skin and muscle all the way to the bone. Reverend Bramwell stood slightly apart, his white hair whipping in the wind, his Bible clutched to his chest as though it might provide warmth if held tightly enough. Ogden did not knock. He stood in front of the door looking at it and did not move. Bramwell said, "Clement, knock." Ogden did not move. His hands hung at his sides. His jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cords. He was looking at the door of the house he had called foolish impractical, a waste of good timber, an exercise in foreign arrogance. He was remembering every word he had said about the structure and the man who built it, and each word was a stone he had to swallow before he could raise his hand. His youngest daughter solved the problem. She was 6 years old and her name was Evangeline, and she did not know about pride or reputation or the social consequences of admitting you were wrong. She knew that she was cold, and she knew that behind this door it was warm because she had heard Mercy Halstead's daughter talk about it, and so she stepped forward and knocked with a fist so small that it barely made a sound against the heavy timber. The door opened. Mercy Halstead stood in the doorway. Not Linus. Mercy. She had heard the small knock and risen from where she was sitting with her children, and she had opened the door, and now she was looking at Clement Ogden with an expression that contained no triumph and no accusation and no satisfaction, only the tired practical recognition of a woman who understood that people sometimes had to lose everything before they could accept help. She stepped aside. The Ogden family entered one by one. The warmth met them at the threshold and followed them inside, wrapping around their frozen bodies like something alive. And Evangeline Ogden sat down beside the hearth and released a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. "Papa," she said, looking up at her father with eyes that were suddenly bright and alive in the firelight. "This house is so warm." Ogden turned his face away. No one in the room looked at him. Not Mercy, not Sterling Darvish, who had arrived a week earlier and understood exactly what Ogden was feeling. Not Charity, who was nursing her youngest by the far wall. And not Linus, who was standing in the corner, farthest from the door, watching Ogden with an expression that was not vindication. It was grief, because looking at Clement Ogden standing rigid and broken in the doorway of the house he had mocked for 7 months. Linus did not see an enemy admitting defeat. He saw Ansel. He saw his brother, stubborn and certain and wrong, too proud to question what he thought he knew, and he saw what would have happened if Ansel had survived that night in Norway. Ansel would have looked exactly like this, rigid, shattered, unable to accept that the thing he had trusted had failed the people he loved. Linus walked across the room. He placed his hand on Ogden's shoulder. 1 second, 2. Then he removed it and went to get blankets for the children. That was all. No words, no recrimination, no "I told you so." Just a hand on a shoulder held long enough to say what neither man could have said out loud. "I understand. I have been exactly where you are, and I am sorry that you had to come here to learn what I learned over a grave in Norway." That night, when everyone was finally asleep, Reverend Bramwell sat beside the hearth with Linus. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with the sounds of breathing, 7 adults and several children sharing 22 square meters of space that Linus had built to keep one person alive, and that was now keeping an entire community from freezing. Bramwell spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "I preached about the sin of pride last September. I called it arrogance when a man places his own knowledge above the wisdom of his community. I was talking about you." Linus said nothing. "I was wrong, not just wrong about you, wrong about what pride means. What you did was not pride. It was conviction. And I confused the two because admitting the difference would have meant admitting that I could not tell them apart. That a man of God, a man whose entire life is supposed to be about discerning truth, could not distinguish between stubbornness and faith." Linus poked the embers with a stick. Sparks rose. "I was also afraid," he said. "Every day on that roof, every log I measured, every corner I cut. I was afraid I was wrong." Bramwell looked at him. "But you kept building." "I kept building because my brother did not. He stopped measuring. He stopped checking. and one poorly cut corner killed him. Fear of being wrong is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to measure twice. Bramwell was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I am sorry, Linus. I know." Outside, the wind howled across the Minnesota prairie like something ancient and hungry and indifferent to everything human beings had built or believed or hoped for. Inside the Octagon, the embers glowed, the walls held, and the people who had spent 7 months calling one man a fool slept safely inside the house he had built for a brother who would never see it. In the days that followed the Ogden family's arrival, the Octagon settled into its final configuration. 15 people, 22 square meters, one hearth, and outside a winter that showed no signs of releasing its grip on the territory. The first morning, Ogden and Linus occupied opposite sides of the room and did not speak. The second morning was the same. On the third morning, the fire needed tending at 4 in the morning, and both men woke at the same moment, drawn from sleep by the slight drop in temperature that each of them, for very different reasons, had trained themselves to detect. They met at the hearth in the dark, each carrying a log. They placed them on the fire simultaneously, one from each side, and the symmetry of the act, accidental but precise, struck them both as faintly absurd. Ogden made a sound that might have been a laugh. Linus made a sound that might have been the same. And then they returned to their respective corners, and the fire burned on. Quarles began teaching Ogden's eldest son, Amos, how to whittle joints using scraps of firewood and a small knife. The boy had his father's hands, broad and powerful, but none of his father's stubbornness, and he absorbed Quarles's instruction with an eagerness that surprised everyone, including himself. Within a week, Amos could cut a dovetail joint that Quarles pronounced acceptable, and the boy carried that compliment like a medal for the rest of the winter. Charity Darvish discovered that Constance, Ogden Clement's wife, knew how to make soap from wood ash and animal fat, and the two women spent several afternoons producing enough soap to keep 15 people marginally clean, a project that Charity later described as the most important engineering achievement of the entire winter, more significant than any Octagon. Nobody argued with her. And in the morning, the snow would still be falling, and the cold would still be waiting, and the winter would still have months left to run. But something had shifted inside those 8 walls that no amount of cold could reverse. The settlement had entered the Octagon as separate families, each carrying their own failures and their own pride. They would leave it in spring as something else entirely. But spring was still far away, and the hardest part was not yet over. The winter solstice passed on December 21st, but nobody inside the Octagon marked it. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement that the longest night of the year had come and gone, because every night felt like the longest night when you were sharing 22 square meters with 7 adults and 6 children, and the only thing separating you from death was 8 walls and a man's refusal to cut corners. By the first week of January, the Octagon had developed its own geography. Linus occupied the northeast corner, where he kept his tools and his book and the quiet space he needed to remain sane. Mercy had claimed the area nearest the hearth, not for herself, but for the children, all 6 of them, who slept in a cluster of blankets and small bodies that she arranged each night with the efficiency of a woman solving a logistics problem. The Darvishes occupied the south wall. The Ogden family took the west. Reverend Bramwell slept wherever there was room, which usually meant near the door where the air was coldest. A penance he never described as penance, but that everyone understood. The arrangement worked for 11 days. Then it stopped working. It began with food. Mercy had established a rationing system during her first week, dividing everything equally by person, regardless of age or size. It was fair, it was transparent. And on the 12th day of full occupancy, Clement Ogden challenged it. "Your boy got the same portion as my eldest," Ogden said during the evening meal. gesturing at Rufus, who was 4 years old and weighed perhaps 35 pounds, and then at his own son Amos, who was 17 and had the body of a man who could fell a tree. "My boy needs twice what yours does. He is twice the size." Mercy did not look up from the pot she was stirring. "Everyone gets the same. That is how it works." That is how it works when a woman who has never fed a family of 5 decides she is in charge of feeding 8 families. The room went still. Sterling Darvish, who had been whittling a toy for his daughter, stopped mid-stroke. Charity put her hand on his arm. Ephraim Quarles, who had arrived at the Octagon 3 days earlier after his own cabin lost a section of roof, looked at the floor. The children, sensing the change in atmosphere, the way animals sense a coming storm, went quiet. Mercy set down her ladle. She stood up straight and looked at Ogden with an expression that was neither angry nor afraid. It was the expression of a woman who had buried her husband alone, driven a wagon 200 miles with 2 children, built a cabin with her own hands, and walked through a blizzard at 2 in the morning to save her son's life. She had earned the right to stand in any room and speak to any man, and everyone present knew it. "Clement, you are welcome in this house. Your family is welcome. But if you want to argue about portions, we can step outside and argue there. The temperature out there will teach you the value of a roof faster than I can." It was Linus's line, almost word for word, the same thing he had said during an earlier moment of tension that Mercy had witnessed. But coming from her, it carried a different weight because Mercy was not the builder of the Octagon. She was the woman who had organized its survival, who had turned a structure into a home, and challenging her authority meant challenging the system that was keeping everyone alive. Ogden sat down. He did not apologize, but he did not raise the issue again. From that night forward, Mercy's rationing system operated without challenge, and something shifted in the internal hierarchy of the Octagon that was never explicitly discussed, but was understood by every adult present. Linus had built the walls. Mercy ran what happened inside them, and nobody questioned either arrangement again. But the crisis that nearly broke everything came 2 weeks later, and it had nothing to do with food or pride or the politics of survival. It came for Rufus. The boy developed a fever on the 3rd of January. It started as a flush in his cheeks that Mercy noticed during the morning meal, a warmth that seemed wrong in a room where warmth was carefully controlled and distributed. By noon, Rufus was shivering despite being wrapped in blankets beside the hearth. By evening, his skin was so hot that Mercy could feel the heat radiating from his small body before her hand touched him. There was no doctor within 50 miles. No medicine except a bottle of willow bark tea that Charity had brought from Ohio, and that was nearly empty. No way to get help, even if help existed, because the snow outside was waist deep and the temperature had not risen above -20 in 3 weeks. Mercy did not sleep that night. She held Rufus against her chest and rocked him and whispered things that no one else could hear, promises and prayers, and the kind of desperate bargaining that parents conduct with God or the universe, or whatever force they believe controls the boundary between life and death. Cora sat beside her mother, silent, watching her brother's face with the terrible focus of a 7-year-old who understands that something is very wrong, but does not yet have the words for what it might be. By the second morning, Linus noticed something else. The air inside the Octagon had changed. With 9 adults and 6 children breathing in a sealed space for nearly 3 weeks, the atmosphere had become thick and stale, carrying a heaviness that pressed against the lungs and made headaches constant. The children coughed more. The adults moved more slowly. And Rufus, whose small body was already fighting a fever, was breathing air that was working against him rather than for him. Linus made a decision that horrified Clement Ogden. "I'm going to cut a ventilation port in the wall," he announced on the morning of the 5th of January, pulling on his coat and gloves. Ogden stood up so fast that his chair fell backward. You are going to open a hole in the wall in the middle of January, in the middle of a winter that is trying to kill us. You are going to let the cold in. I am going to let the bad air out. The boy is sick. The air in here is making it worse. A small opening with a cover that can be closed position high on the wall where warm air naturally rises will create circulation without significant heat loss. You do not know that. I know that the boy's fever has not broken in 2 days and the air in this room smells like a cellar. I know that fresh air will help him and stale air will not. And I know that I can cut a vent and seal it properly in 6 hours. Ogden looked around the room for support. He found none. Sterling Darvish was staring at Rufus's flushed face. Charity was watching Linus with the expression of a woman who had already made up her mind. Quarles was reaching for his own coat. And Mercy was looking at Linus with something that Ogden had never seen on her face before, a trust so complete and so unguarded that it made him feel like he was intruding on something private. "If you kill us all," Ogden said, but he did not finish the sentence. He sat down and said nothing more. Linus went outside. The cold hit him like a physical assault, a force that found every gap in his clothing and drove needles of ice into his skin within seconds. He walked to the north wall, the wall most sheltered from the prevailing wind, and began to work. He cut for 6 hours. His hands cramped so badly that he had to stop every 20 minutes to beat them against his thighs until feeling returned. His broadaxe, the Norwegian axe he had brought across the Atlantic, the axe that had belonged to his grandfather and his father, and had shaped every log in this structure, rang against the frozen wood with a sound like church bells struck with hammers. He cut precisely. A rectangular opening 20 centimeters wide and 10 centimeters tall, positioned just below the ceiling on the interior side, angled slightly downward on the exterior to prevent rain or snow from entering. He fashioned a sliding cover from a piece of oak planking, fitted it with leather hinges, and tested it 17 times before he was satisfied. The cost was a frost-bitten finger on his left hand. The third finger, the one that bore the most pressure when he gripped the axe handle. He did not notice it until he came back inside and tried to unfasten his coat and found that the finger would not bend. It was white and rigid and numb, and when the feeling began to return over the next hour, the pain was extraordinary. Mercy saw it before he could hide it. She crossed the room, took his hand without asking, examined the finger with the focused attention she had previously reserved for her children, and began the treatment she had learned from a doctor's wife back in Pennsylvania. Clean cloth, slow warming, no rubbing which could damage the tissue further. She wrapped the finger carefully, and when she was done, she held his hand for a moment longer than necessary. "You did not have to do that," she said. She was talking about the vent. She was also talking about the finger and the 6 hours in killing cold, and the fact that he had risked permanent damage to his hands, his carpenter's hands, the tools he needed more than any other tools he owned for a boy who was not his son. "Yes, I did," Linus said, and Mercy understood that he was not talking about Will. He was talking about Ansel, about the promise, about the fact that he had built this octagon so that no one would die from a building flaw. And if a child died because the air inside was poisoned by overcrowding, that was a flaw he had not anticipated, and fixing it was not optional. The vent worked. Within 12 hours, the air quality improved noticeably. The headaches diminished, the coughing reduced, and Rufus's fever broke on the morning of the 7th, 2 days after Linus cut the hole in his wall with a frostbitten finger, and the kind of determination that cannot be taught or learned, but only carried like a stone from one loss to the next. Mercy woke that morning to find Rufus sitting up, asking for food, his eyes clear and bright and alive. She pulled him into her arms and held him so tightly that he protested, and when she finally released him, she looked across the room at Linus, who was sitting in his corner, rewrapping his bandaged finger. She did not say thank you. The words were inadequate, and they both knew it. She simply met his eyes, and in the look that passed between them was the weight of every sleepless night, every prayer, every moment of terror, when she had felt her son's burning forehead and wondered if this was how she would lose a second member of her family to the frontier. Linus met her gaze and smiled, and then he smiled, not the small, private smile of a man receiving gratitude, but the wide, unguarded smile of a man who has just learned that the worst thing he feared did not happen, that this time, unlike the last time the child survived. The remaining weeks of winter passed in a rhythm that was exhausting and cramped and sometimes nearly unbearable, but never cold. February brought a different kind of challenge. The physical danger of freezing had been conquered, but the psychological toll of confinement was mounting. 15 people in 22 square meters for 3 months. The smell of unwashed bodies and wood smoke and drying boots. The constant noise of children who had energy but no space to spend it. The way adults who had been independent their entire lives had to negotiate every movement, every meal, every trip to the outhouse that required bundling up, as though preparing for an Arctic expedition, just to walk 15 feet through snow that reached your waist. Ogden's wife, a woman named Constance, who had spoken perhaps 50 words in the entire time the families had been sharing the Octagon, broke one afternoon. She stood in the middle of the room and shouted that she could not breathe, that the walls were closing in, that she needed to go outside or she would lose her mind entirely. She was not being dramatic. She was describing with perfect accuracy the claustrophobia that was eating at every adult in the room, but that nobody else had the courage to name. Mercy handled it. She took Constance's hands and led her to the ventilation port that Linus had cut, opened it, and let the cold air hit her face. "Breathe," Mercy said. "Just breathe. The cold is terrible, but it is also real, and sometimes real things are easier to bear than the things we imagine." Constance breathed. The cold air stung her face and filled her lungs, and after 5 minutes she closed the vent and sat down and did not shout again for the rest of the winter. Ogden watched his wife being calmed by the widow he had insulted over food portions 2 weeks earlier, and something in his face changed in a way that was too small to see, but too significant to miss. He walked to where Mercy was sitting and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "Thank you." It was the first time he had thanked anyone for anything since the winter began, and Mercy received it with a brief squeeze of his arm that communicated more than any verbal response could have. Ogden and Linus did not become friends. That would come later if it came at all, and neither man was the type to force a friendship that had not yet earned itself. But something changed between them on a morning in late January that was in its own way more meaningful than friendship. They were outside chopping firewood. It was a task that had to be done quickly because exposed skin began to freeze within minutes, and it required 2 people because one person needed to hold the log steady while the other swung the axe. For 3 weeks they had done this in complete silence, working with the wordless coordination of men who understand physical labor and need no conversation to perform it efficiently. On this particular morning, Ogden stopped swinging. He stood with the axe resting on the chopping block and stared at the tree line for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, as though the words had been lodged somewhere deep and had torn something loose on their way out. "The first house I built, back in Pennsylvania, the corners cracked the first winter. Same problem, same failures. Lost heat through every joint. My wife nearly left me over it. I told her it was the timber, bad batch from the mill, told everyone that, told myself that. 30 years I've been telling that story." He did not look at Linus. Linus did not look at him. "It was not the timber," Ogden said. A long silence followed. The wind moved across the snowfield between them and the tree line, carrying ice crystals that caught the low January sun like fragments of broken glass. My grandfather built square houses before he built octagons, Linus said. Nobody is born knowing. Ogden looked at Linus then. For the first time in all the months they had known each other, his face was open. Not friendly exactly. Ogden would never be a man whose face did friendly easily, but open, receptive. The face of a man who has set down something he has been carrying for 30 years and is feeling for the first time the strange lightness of honesty. Come spring, Ogden said, teach me to cut a 135-degree angle. It was not forgiveness. It was not an apology. It was one craftsman asking another craftsman to share his knowledge, and it was the only form of respect that either man would have recognized as genuine. Linus nodded. Come spring. Spring came in the middle of March, announced not by any single dramatic event, but by a gradual softening of everything. The wind lost its edge. The snow began to shrink, pulling back from the bases of trees and buildings like a retreating army that has finally decided the ground is not worth holding. Water appeared in places it had not been seen for 4 months, trickling through the settlement in small streams that grew wider each day until the sound of running water became constant, a background music that replaced the silence of the frozen world that was slowly, reluctantly dying. The people emerged from the Octagon on a Tuesday, not all at once, but in stages, as though the act of leaving required a gradual adjustment that could not be rushed. The children went first, bursting through the door and running across the wet snow with the manic energy that 4 months of confinement had compressed to the breaking point. Cora Halstead chased Evangeline Ogden around the Octagon 3 times before both of them collapsed laughing in a snowbank that was melting fast enough to soak their clothes in seconds. The adults followed more slowly. They stood blinking in the sunlight, which seemed impossibly bright after months of firelight and lantern glow, and they looked at the settlement around them and saw what the winter had done. The rectangular cabins were ruined. Some had collapsed entirely, their walls buckled inward under the combined weight of snow and structural failure. Others were still standing, but clearly uninhabitable. Their joints separated their roofs, sagging their interiors open to the elements through cracks and gaps that no amount of spring repair could adequately fix. Ogden walked to his own cabin first. He stood in the doorway and looked at the interior he had built in 3 weeks the previous summer, the interior he had been so proud of, the interior that had failed his family so completely that his 6-year-old daughter had been the one brave enough to knock on another man's door because her father could not. The 4 corners had separated, each one. Every joint where the logs met at 90 degrees had opened, some by a few centimeters, some by enough to put a hand through. Snowmelt was pooling on the floor. A bird had built a nest in the rafters, having entered through a gap in the south wall that was large enough to accommodate a wingspan. He stood there for a long time. Constance came up behind him and put her hand on his back, but she did not speak because there was nothing to say that the evidence in front of them was not already saying more clearly. Sterling Darvish found his hexagonal plot empty. The cabin he had built, the one with walls of 15 centimeters, had collapsed entirely during a February blizzard that the occupants of the Octagon had heard but not seen. The logs lay scattered across the snow like bones. Charity surveyed the wreckage and said without any particular emotion, "Well, that saves us the trouble of taking it apart." Sterling looked at her, looked at the debris, and for the first time in their marriage, offered no argument whatsoever. The Octagon stood untouched. Its walls were straight. Its roof was intact. The vent Linus had cut in January was closed, its oak cover fitted flush against the wall. 8 sides, 8 walls, built by one man for a brother who would never see it and occupied by an entire community that had entered as strangers and was leaving as something no one had a word for yet. Ephraim Quarles was the first to act. Even before the snow had fully melted, before the ground was soft enough to dig in comfortably, he was out on his parcel with stakes and string, measuring an octagon on the ground. He had spent the winter watching Linus's walls, studying every joint, copying specifications into a notebook by firelight, asking questions in the quiet hours of the night when the others were sleeping and Linus was willing to talk. He had absorbed 4 months of education in structural engineering, thermodynamics, and Norwegian carpentry, and he was ready. Linus came to inspect Quarles's layout on the second day. He walked the perimeter, checking angles, testing string tension, examining the ground for drainage patterns. At the fourth corner, he knelt down and looked at the angle Quarles had marked. It was precise. It was correct. Linus looked up at Quarles, and for the first time since arriving in Minnesota, his face showed something that was not determination or grief or patience, but simple, uncomplicated pleasure. The pleasure of a teacher seeing a student get it right. "Good," he said. Quarles smiled. "I had a good winter to study." Sterling Darvish began his own structure a week later. A hexagon, 6 sides instead of 8, simpler to build, but based on the same principles Linus had demonstrated. Charity supervised every phase of the construction with an intensity that Sterling found exhausting and everyone else found entirely appropriate. When Sterling complained that she was more demanding than the Norwegian, Charity replied without looking up from the angle she was checking, "Good, that means I am doing it right." Sterling opened his mouth to argue, realized he had no argument that would survive the memory of his daughter going silent in a cabin he had built too fast, and closed it again. Charity permitted herself a small, private smile that she directed at the spirit level in her hands rather than at her husband, because she was merciful enough to let him keep his dignity in public. Ogden rebuilt. He chose a square design because he was too stubborn to change the fundamental shape of his worldview, and everyone who knew him understood that this was as close to flexibility as Clement Ogden would ever come. But the walls were double thickness. The foundation was stone dug deep. And when Linus walked past Ogden's building site one afternoon and saw the gap between the inner and outer walls being filled with the insulation mixture, he paused. Ogden was on his knees packing the material with his bare hands, working it into every gap and void with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who has learned the hard way what happens when you leave spaces for the cold to find. Linus nodded. Ogden saw the nod and returned it. Neither man spoke. Neither man needed to. The nod contained everything: acknowledgement, respect, and the understanding that some lessons are so expensive that the only appropriate response is to prove you have learned them. But the moment that mattered most that spring, the moment that would be talked about in Clearwater County for years afterward, belonged to Mercy Halstead. She had been planning it since February. During the long, dark nights inside the Octagon while the others slept, Mercy had been studying Linus's walls. Not the technical details which she left to Quarles in his notebook, but the proportions. The way the 8 walls created a space that felt larger than its measurements suggested. The way the central hearth distributed warmth to every corner equally so that no child sleeping against any wall was colder than any other child sleeping against any other wall. She studied these things not as an architect, but as a mother with the specific intelligence of a woman who needs to understand whether a design will keep her children alive. She also studied Linus. Not romantically, though several people in the Octagon assumed otherwise, and kept their assumptions to themselves. She studied him the way you study a person who has solved a problem you did not know you had. She watched how he checked the vent cover every morning and evening, adjusting it based on wind direction. She watched how he maintained the hearth, banking the fire at night, with a precision that ensured it would burn evenly until dawn without needing attention. She watched how he moved through the space he had built, touching the wall, sometimes as he passed. The way a horseman touches his horse, not for any practical reason, but because the contact itself was a kind of conversation between builder and built. By March, she had made her decision. She was going to build an octagon of her own. Not because Linus had told her to. He had never suggested it, never hinted, never presumed to advise her on anything. She was going to build one because she had spent 4 months living inside the evidence, and the evidence was conclusive. She walked into Micah Pemberton's supply yard on a Tuesday morning in April with Cora holding her right hand and Rufus holding her left, and she told Pemberton she wanted to buy lumber for a new house. Pemberton looked at her the way he looked at everyone who came to him wanting things they could not afford. "What kind of house?" "An octagon." Pemberton paused. He looked at Mercy, this woman who weighed perhaps 110 pounds and stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and had 2 small children attached to her like satellites orbiting a planet, and he tried to calculate whether she was serious. "You want to build an octagonal cabin by yourself. I want to buy the lumber. The building I will handle." "Mrs. Halstead, with respect, that is the most complex design anyone has attempted in this settlement. Newberry himself spent 6 months on it. You cannot possibly expect to do something like that alone." Mercy's expression did not change. She had anticipated this conversation and prepared for it the way she prepared for everything thoroughly and without sentimentality. "Mr. Pemberton last winter, who survived and who nearly died, I am not asking a philosophical question. I am asking about your customer base. In 6 months, every family in this settlement is going to be buying materials to rebuild. When they come to you, they are going to ask what kind of structure you recommend. You can tell them to build the same rectangles that collapsed, in which case they will wonder why they should take advice from a man who watched his entire customer base nearly freeze to death. Or you can tell them you sell materials for octagonal construction, and you can point to the houses being built by Quarles, Darvish, and Halstead as proof that the design works for everyone, not just Norwegian carpenters." Pemberton looked at her for a very long time. "I need credit," Mercy continued. "Deferred payment. I will pay you back after the first harvest with interest." "What interest?" 10%. Make it 12. "Done." Mercy Halstead walked out of Pemberton's supply yard with a lumber order and a payment plan, and the distinction of being the first woman in the settlement to commission the construction of her own home on her own terms with her own negotiation. She did not tell Linus what she had done. She did not tell anyone. She simply appeared on her parcel the following morning with stakes and string and began to measure. Cora noticed first. She had been playing at the edge of the building site, drawing pictures in the mud with a stick when she looked up and saw the octagonal outline her mother was marking on the ground. The girl stood and walked to where Mercy was driving the third stake, and her face broke into the widest smile Mercy had seen on her daughter since before Ira died. "Mama," Cora said, "it looks like Mr. Linus's house." Mercy knelt down so she was at eye level with her daughter. She took Cora's face in both hands and said with a firmness that was also tenderness, "No, baby, this is our house." From 30 meters away, Linus Newberry stood watching. He had been on his way to check on Quarles's construction when he noticed Mercy measuring her parcel, and he had stopped. He watched her drive stakes and stretch string and check angles with a carpenter's square she had borrowed from Quarles, and he watched the octagon take shape on the ground, precise and deliberate and unmistakably intentional. He stood there for a long time. The spring wind moved across the Minnesota prairie, carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth, and the sounds of hammers and saws from half a dozen building sites where families were reconstructing their lives on foundations both literal and metaphorical that were stronger than what they had built before. Linus thought about Ansel. He did not think about the death. He did not think about the grave or the frozen ground or the chair facing the failed corner. He thought about what Ansel would have said if he could see this. A settlement in Minnesota 8,000 miles from the Norwegian coast, where a widow with two children and a German carpenter and an Irish couple, and even a stubborn Pennsylvania farmer were building houses based on principles that Linus's grandfather had developed to survive North Sea winters. The knowledge had traveled across an ocean and through a death and into a book's margin and out the other side into something living, something growing, something that would outlast every person who had contributed to its journey. Linus reached into his coat and took out the book. Fowler's A Home for All, so battered now that the binding was more repair than original, the pages swollen with moisture and worn thin at the edges from 10,000 turnings. He opened it to the page he had marked on the ship, the page about thermal efficiency, the page with 2 words in pencil in the margin. For Ansel, he read the words. He looked at Mercy measuring her octagon. He looked at Quarles raising his walls. He heard Charity Darvish's voice carrying across the clearing, correcting Sterling about something that Sterling would eventually concede she was right about. He heard the sound of Ogden's axe biting into timber, steady and rhythmic and purposeful. He closed the book, set it on his knee, and sat in the spring sunlight watching as the world he had built, one angle at a time, continued to grow beyond him. On the first swan day of summer, Reverend Hiram Bramwell stood before the settlement and delivered a sermon. It was not like the sermon he had given the previous September, the one about pride and arrogance, and the danger of placing your own knowledge above the wisdom of your community. This sermon was about something else entirely. He spoke about patience, about the courage required to do something correctly when everyone around you is doing it quickly, about the wisdom that comes from far away from other lands and other traditions, and the sin of dismissing it simply because it is unfamiliar. He spoke about a winter that had tested everything they believed about themselves and found most of it insufficient, and about the spring that followed, in which they had been given the rare and painful gift of a second chance. He did not mention Linus by name, but when the congregation looked toward the Norwegian, their faces carried something that had not been there a year ago. It was not admiration exactly. It was recognition. The recognition that this quiet man with his strange book and his foreign tools had been right about something that mattered more than anyone's opinion, and that his rightness had saved their lives. Linus met Bramwell's eyes and touched the brim of his hat. Bramwell returned the gesture with a slight bow of his head, and the exchange, identical in meaning to the one they had shared on a winter night over dying embers, now carried a different meaning. In winter, it had been confession and forgiveness. In summer, it was partnership. That evening, as the sun moved toward the horizon and the air filled with the sounds of a community rebuilding itself, Linus Newberry sat on the steps of his octagon for the last time as a man alone. Tomorrow, Quarles would come for advice on his roof beams. Darvish would stop by to argue about hexagonal angles, which he still did not fully understand, while Charity stood behind him, mouthing the correct answers. Ogden would walk past without speaking, but would slow his pace as he passed Linus's building site, as he always did now, studying the joints with the careful eye of a man who is still learning and knows it. And Mercy would be on her own parcel, measuring her own octagon, building her own home, teaching Cora to hold a spirit level while Rufus played in the sawdust. Linus opened the book one final time. The evening light fell across the margin of the page, illuminating 2 words written in pencil by a man on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. A man who was carrying his dead brother's memory across the water and did not yet know that the house he would build with that memory would save not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. For Ansel, he closed the book. He set it beside him on the step, and he sat in the fading light of a Minnesota evening, watching the settlement that had grown from his grief, and he felt something he had not felt since before his brother died. He felt that it was enough. We called him a fool. Every one of us, we called him a fool. But the fool built the only house that stood through the worst winter any of us had ever seen. And when we knocked on his door, one family at a time, frozen and broken and ashamed, he never reminded us of a single word we had said. He just opened the door. That was the greatest lesson I learned in the winter of 1857. Not about angles or double walls or the mathematics of eight-sided structures, about what kind of person deserves your trust. Not the loudest voice, not the most experienced hand, the one who measures most carefully, and the one who opens the door without asking why it took you so long to knock.